This lens for the Canon R7 and Canon R10 is so odd looking that I think if you didn't know what it was for or what it was about, you would think it was broken. But this is actually a very specialized lens, and it's quite a unique lens on this mount. Now, this is what is called a tilt macro lens. That doesn't mean that you only have to use it for macro. You can use it for portrait photography and other types of general photography, product photography, for example. But this lens really shines when you use it for macro photography. And the key feature and the thing that you really notice when you have a look at this lens is this boxy shape, and when you are actually using the tilt function, how the lens looks all out of kilter. And this tilt function allows you to adjust the plane of focus of the lens. So I've just adjusted it to the straight neutral position. So this is would take a picture like any normal lens would. And then I can engage the tilt function just by turning it up like this, picking my tilt position, and then it has a little lock dial on the other side. Why this is useful is because when you are shooting macro photography, just like any type of photography, the closer you get to your subject, the more shallow the depth of field is. So the more shallow the area is that is in focus. So you very quickly get out of focus background and out of focus foreground. But when we are doing macro photography, we often want as much as possible to be in focus because we want to capture all those details of the macro photo. This allows you to adjust that focus plane, so if the thing you're shooting at isn't just flat in line with the lens, you can tilt it and you can change the focus plane so the focus plane is more in line with what you're taking a photo of. And this has been useful for me in a variety of different types of macro photography, including insect photography. Insect photography is actually considered the most accessible form of wildlife photography because almost everybody has insects around them. And macro photography for insects or with insects is really incredible. And when it's done right, you get a view into a world that you just don't get to see any other way. And it's not something that you're just seeing on the TV or seeing on the internet. You're really seeing something in your backyard that you've never seen before. And I will put a link to the lens and all the equipment I use to take these photos in the description down below. And the way I use this lens for insect photography is as I approach the insect, I just determined sort of where I was going to be in relation to the insect, and I just tilted the lens in the position to give me sort of the deepest focus area based on how I was sitting compared to that insect. So if I was sort of up over top of the insect, I would tilt it down to get me a better focus plane that way. If I was straight onto the side of the insect, I would just turn it to the neutral position so it was just a straight lens. Or if I was coming from underneath the insect shooting up at it, I would tilt the lens up. And this was really very simple, very quick, and essentially I would just set the lens and I would sort of move myself into those different positions. And it really does make quite a difference. Now here's just a really simplified example of how this works. I've just thrown a photo on screen now, and this is a screw on a table. And if you look at the grain of the wood, either side of that screw going to the edge of the plank of that table, in this first photo, you will notice that they are out of focus. I then take the lens and I tilt it into the position where I'm pointing the lens down because I'm coming sort of from on top of that plank of wood and that screw. And what you'll see is the area that is in focus is much deeper. It goes almost to the very edges of that wood. So when you compare these two photos, you kind of get a very simplified idea of how, even though all the settings on the lens and in the camera are the same, just shifting this focus plane is getting me a deeper area in focus. Now, the first thing you're going to notice when you pick up this lens is how heavy it is. I mean, this thing is built like an absolute tank. It feels like a weapon. I would say that the lens itself probably weighs twice as much as the Canon R7 body, even with my cage on it. So it is a very heavy lens. It feels very well built, but it in some ways almost feels too well built and almost feels like a piece of agricultural equipment. It is so heavy. The other thing that I've noticed is the focus ring and the aperture ring on the lens. It's metal, it's all metal, and then it's like a grooved, engraved surface. This really feels like a lens almost from the 1960s, the way it's built. Now, once again, this doesn't affect the optical quality, and I think that it certainly is more robust than most modern lenses, but it is a little bit unusual. And you do have to be aware of the really heavy weight. You are going to notice this if you walk around with it for a while. It is a very, very heavy lens. Now, it is important to note that this is a manual focus, manual aperture lens. Now, with macro photography and dedicated macro photography, most of the time you are using manual focus anyways. And in my situation, 100% of the time. Even if I have an autofocus lens, I use manual focus. And the reason for that is it is much easier to focus with moving the lens back and forth in relation to your subject than it is to get the autofocus to lock on. And in most situations, autofocus is not super effective when you're getting so close to the subject and you are sort of freehand moving. So I always use manual focus anyways. And all I did with this lens for most of these shots is I set the manual focus to the minimum distance. And then when I got to the subject, I just moved in and out until it was in focus. And then I just fired on it. Now, for most of these shots, I also did use a flash. I've got a flash configuration with the diffuser on the top. So if you want to see a video about how to use that flash diffuser setup with this lens and this camera combination, just let me know in the description down below, and I'll try to get to making a video about how I actually took these shots. Now, are there any negative issues that I found about this lens? Really, there was only one. At 85 millimeters, which is what the focal length of this lens is, it should be an ideal walk-around portrait lens. 85 millimeters is an excellent sort of focal length for portraits, and it is used all the time in professional photography, fashion photography, beauty photography, what have you. It's a great focal length for that. But the way that the focus system is geared on this, it has got a really nice focus throw when you've got something close. You're really easily able to dial that close focus in on macro photos or close photography photos. When you get to the sort of the maximum distance, when you're out towards infinity and you're stepping back and you're getting a sort of a headshot or a full body shot with this lens, for whatever reason, the way that it's tuned, the difference is just minor. You just breathe on it and you've passed the focus plane past the person, and you just bring it back a little and now you're too close. So focusing on objects at a different distance is possible, but challenging. And because of that, I think it isn't really an ideal sort of double duty lens as a macro lens and a portrait lens. Now, if you're looking for a lens mainly for macro with a little bit of portrait mixed in, then I could still recommend this lens because you could kind of work with it. And if you go out and buy a portrait lens and want to do macro with it, it's not going to do macro anything like this. So for primarily macro with a little bit of mixed in sort of portrait photography, it's okay. But I wouldn't sort of buy this lens thinking that you're going to do 50% of your portrait photography or 50% of your use of this lens is going to be portrait photography. It's just not ideal for that because of that focus issue. Now, this is an incredibly unique lens on the RF mount, and for macro photography, it's definitely the best lens that I've ever used on this mount. But if you would like a lens for dedicated cinematic video and portrait photography, I've just thrown a video on screen now, and to date in my testing of the Canon R7, this is my very favorite lens with this camera.